The magnitude of the fraud in Minnesota cannot be overstated. It's staggering amounts of money that have been lost.
At around 8 in the morning in Minnesota, the state court system was operating as usual. There were no emergency alerts, no public disturbances, and no visible disruption at the courthouse. Yet inside one courtroom, a single decision would soon send shockwaves through Minnesota's entire fraud enforcement system. The case involved a $7.2 million Medicaid fraud scheme centered on two defendants who operated a home healthcare business accused of submitting false billing claims over an extended period. After a full trial, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict based on financial records, billing data, and evidence showing large sums of money transferred directly into personal accounts. That verdict did not stand. Sarah West, a Minnesota state judge, unilaterally overturned the jury's decision, vacating the convictions and effectively ending the case at the state level. Her ruling did not dispute that fraud had occurred, but argued that prosecutors failed to prove which individual was directly responsible for the criminal conduct. This was not judicial independence. This was a collapse triggered from inside the system. The impact was immediate. Related fraud cases began to unravel, public confidence in the justice system weakened, and serious questions emerged about Minnesota's ability to prosecute complex financial crimes. When a jury's unanimous verdict is no longer the final step toward accountability, the issue extends far beyond one courtroom and becomes a matter of national concern. Like and subscribe to Military Power, because this story does not stop at one courtroom. The Medicaid fraud case at the center of this controversy was not built on vague accusations or incomplete records. It focused on a home healthcare business operating under Minnesota's Medicaid Personal Care Assistant Program, a system designed to reimburse providers for in-home services delivered to elderly and disabled patients. The program relies heavily on accurate reporting, documented hours, and verified care activities, making it particularly vulnerable to abuse when oversight fails. According to state prosecutors, the defendants exploited this structure by submitting false billing claims over an extended period. Investigators allege that hours were inflated, services were billed that were never delivered, and documentation was generated to support claims that did not reflect actual patient care. The conduct was not described as sporadic or accidental, but as a repeated pattern embedded into the daily operations of the business. Financial evidence played a central role in the case. Prosecutors presented records showing that Medicaid reimbursements were first deposited into company accounts, then transferred into personal bank accounts controlled by the defendants. From there, the money was used for private expenses unrelated to healthcare services. Billing logs, bank statements, and internal records were introduced to demonstrate how public funds moved away from patient care and into personal use. The state argued that this financial trail established both motive and method. This evidentiary clarity carried into the jury's deliberations. After reviewing the documentation and testimony, the jury returned a unanimous guilty verdict, doing so without prolonged debate. Legal analysts noted that the speed of the decision suggested the facts were not deeply contested. In white-collar fraud cases, juries often struggle with complexity and conflicting interpretations. In this instance, the financial narrative appeared direct and consistent. The case seemed resolved. That perception changed abruptly when the presiding judge intervened. In a single ruling, the court overturned the jury's verdict and vacated the convictions, effectively ending the prosecution at the state level. The decision did not dispute that fraudulent conduct had occurred within the business. Instead, it focused on a narrower legal question: whether prosecutors had proven which specific individual was personally responsible for each criminal act. The judge concluded that, while the evidence demonstrated the existence of a fraudulent operation, the state failed to meet the legal threshold required to assign direct criminal liability to a named individual. Without that precise attribution, the verdict could not legally stand. This distinction transformed the case from a concluded prosecution into a systemic concern. A matter once defined by stolen public funds became a test of how responsibility is assigned within complex organizations. The ruling exposed a fault line between demonstrating wrongdoing and proving individual accountability, a gap with implications far beyond this case. This is where the story stops being about money and starts being about responsibility. Once the court overturned the jury's verdict, attention shifted away from legal arguments and back to the financial record itself, because the underlying evidence had not changed. The ruling erased the conviction, but it did not erase the money trail. Investigators reviewing the case emphasized that the financial framework of the alleged fraud remained intact, documented, and traceable from start to finish. At the center of the scheme was a shell home healthcare company, formally registered to operate under Minnesota's Medicaid Personal Care Assistant Program. On paper, the business complied with regulatory requirements. It maintained billing systems, submitted reimbursement claims, and filed the documentation expected of a legitimate provider. However, prosecutors argued that this compliance was superficial. In practice, the company functioned as a pass-through entity designed to receive public funds and redirect them elsewhere. According to financial records presented during the trial, Medicaid reimbursements were deposited into company accounts and then quickly transferred into personal bank accounts controlled by the defendants. These transfers were not sporadic or incidental. Analysts identified repeated movement of funds that occurred shortly after reimbursements were issued, suggesting a deliberate process rather than administrative coincidence. Once in personal accounts, the money was used for private expenses unrelated to patient care. Investigators also highlighted large-scale cash withdrawals, often occurring in consistent patterns over time. Prosecutors argued that these withdrawals did not align with normal operational needs for a healthcare provider, particularly one that primarily paid staff through documented payroll systems. Instead, the withdrawals appeared alongside billing volumes that exceeded staffing capacity and service logs that failed to correspond with actual care delivery. The financial behavior raised questions not only about fraud, but about intent and control. Crucially, the money did not disappear. It did not move through obscure offshore accounts or vanish into untraceable channels. The funds followed predictable routes, passed through identifiable accounts, and left a trail that investigators could reconstruct transaction by transaction. This point became central after the verdict was vacated. The financial evidence did not suggest uncertainty about whether fraud had occurred. It showed consistency, repetition, and organization. What changed was not the evidence, but how the evidence was legally interpreted. The court's ruling introduced a sharp distinction between proving that a fraudulent operation existed and proving which individual was personally responsible for each act within that operation. Under this reasoning, the existence of a coordinated scheme and the movement of money were not sufficient. Prosecutors were required to demonstrate precise, individual-level responsibility for each fraudulent transaction, even within a tightly controlled business structure. This is where the role of the jury became critical. Jurors did not express doubt about the presence of fraud. Their unanimous verdict reflected a shared conclusion that the operation was intentional and sustained. The verdict was not invalidated because jurors misunderstood the facts or ignored the evidence. It was nullified because a legal standard was applied that reframed responsibility in a far narrower way than the jury's findings allowed. Legal analysts warned that this shift carried consequences well beyond a single Medicaid case. White-collar fraud prosecutions frequently rely on patterns of behavior, financial flows, and organizational control, particularly when companies are structured to diffuse accountability across multiple roles. If prosecutors must prove exactly which individual authorized or executed each transaction, even when ownership and decision-making are centralized, many complex fraud cases become legally fragile. This concern extended beyond healthcare fraud. Tax evasion, financial crimes involving shell companies, and cases tied to public benefit programs often depend on demonstrating control rather than documenting every individual action. The ruling suggested that unless responsibility could be isolated with near mechanical precision, convictions could be vulnerable to reversal. That realization marked the first true breakpoint in the case. What began as a high-profile Medicaid fraud prosecution evolved into a broader exposure of structural risk within the justice system itself. The issue was no longer limited to stolen funds or a single business. It was about whether existing legal standards could effectively address modern financial crimes designed to obscure responsibility through layered structures. If this standard were to remain in place, its implications would ripple across the state's enforcement landscape. Prosecutors would face higher burdens, complex cases would become harder to sustain, and deterrence could weaken as accountability became more difficult to assign. From this moment on, every fraud case in the state was suddenly at risk. The collapse of the state prosecution marked a decisive strategic shift. What Minnesota prosecutors could no longer advance under state law did not vanish, nor was it quietly set aside. Instead, the case crossed a legal threshold. Responsibility moved beyond the reach of state courts and into the realm of federal enforcement, where a different set of statutes, standards, and investigative tools applied. That transition was visible almost immediately. Multiple federal agencies began coordinated reviews, not as a reactionary gesture, but as a structured response to a case involving federally funded programs and complex financial conduct. The Federal Bureau of Investigation focused on reconstructing the financial architecture of the operation, examining how funds moved between corporate and personal accounts, how transactions were timed, and whether the pattern suggested intentional misuse rather than administrative error. Investigators revisited bank records, internal controls, and ownership structures to determine who exercised effective control over the flow of money. At the same time, the U.S. Department of the Treasury, through its financial crime and enforcement units, analyzed transaction data at a broader level. Their review centered on cash withdrawals, repetitive transfers, and indicators commonly associated with illicit financial activity. Treasury analysts assessed whether the movement of funds met federal thresholds for money laundering statutes, particularly when public money is rapidly diverted into personal use. Patterns that might be insufficient for prosecution under state law can carry different weight under federal financial regulations, especially when consistency and intent are demonstrated across multiple transactions. Parallel to these efforts, Immigration and Customs Enforcement evaluated whether immigration-related violations were connected to the business or individuals involved. This review did not assume wrongdoing, but it examined employment practices, documentation, and benefit eligibility to determine whether federal immigration laws intersected with the alleged financial misconduct. In cases involving healthcare businesses, employment structures and benefit programs often overlap with federal jurisdiction, creating additional exposure beyond the original fraud allegations. This coordinated response underscored a key reality. Federal enforcement is not bound by the same limitations that constrained the state case. Federal statutes are designed to address multi-layered financial crimes, particularly those that cross administrative boundaries, involve federal funding, or exploit systemic weaknesses. Investigators therefore began evaluating potential charges that extended well beyond the original Medicaid fraud count. These included wire fraud, which focuses on the use of electronic communications to execute a scheme, money laundering, which targets the movement and concealment of illicit proceeds, and federal benefit fraud, which applies when national programs are abused regardless of where the activity occurs. The shift highlighted a defining feature of the American legal system. Enforcement is layered by design. When one level becomes constrained by legal interpretation or procedural limits, another level is structured to activate. A state court decision does not immunize conduct from federal scrutiny, particularly when the conduct involves federal money. Medicaid, while administered at the state level, is fundamentally a federally funded program which places alleged misuse squarely within federal jurisdiction. Officials familiar with the process emphasized that this transition was procedural, not political. The federal review did not hinge on disagreement with the state court's reasoning, nor was it intended as a rebuke of the judiciary. Instead, it reflected a jurisdictional reality. Federal investigators are tasked with determining whether federal laws were violated using federal evidentiary standards. Those standards differ in scope and application, particularly in cases involving organized financial conduct and systemic abuse. Importantly, the federal inquiry did not depend on the jury's overturned verdict, nor was it limited by the legal interpretation that invalidated that verdict. Federal prosecutors assess cases independently, weighing whether the available evidence supports charges under federal statutes. The same financial records that proved insufficient under a narrow state standard could carry different significance when evaluated through a federal lens focused on patterns, control, and misuse of public funds. As a result, the case was reframed entirely. What began as a state-level Medicaid fraud prosecution evolved into a nationally relevant federal inquiry. The central question shifted. It was no longer whether Minnesota could assign responsibility under its statutes, but whether the federal system could reassert accountability using a broader and more adaptable legal framework. This moment represented the true escalation of the case. Not an escalation driven by punishment or spectacle, but by institutional design. The federal response demonstrated how the system compensates when one pathway closes and another opens, ensuring that complex financial crimes do not simply disappear into legal gaps. This wasn't an escalation for punishment. This was escalation for accountability. With courtroom proceedings effectively frozen, the center of gravity in the case shifted decisively away from judges and juries. The legal drama paused, and in its place began a quieter, more consequential phase. There were no gavels striking wood, no witnesses taking the stand, and no public arguments shaping headlines. Instead, the work moved into secured analysis rooms, where investigators, financial specialists, and federal analysts began a comprehensive review of how the fraud had been allowed to exist in the first place. The process was technical and deliberate. Laptops stayed open for long stretches as teams compared financial ledgers against Medicaid billing records. Transaction data was reconstructed line by line, not to re-argue guilt, but to understand structure. Analysts worked through bank statements, cash withdrawal logs, reimbursement histories, and internal documentation, mapping how money entered the system and how it exited. The objective was not to uncover new dramatic evidence, but to identify the weak points that had made the scheme sustainable over time. What emerged was a clearer picture of systemic vulnerability. Investigators identified significant gaps within the Medicaid reimbursement framework, particularly in how claims were reviewed and verified. The system relied heavily on information submitted by providers themselves, assuming accuracy unless inconsistencies were obvious. Real-time validation of whether services were actually delivered was limited, and follow-up audits often occurred long after payments had already been released. When documentation appeared complete on paper, payments frequently moved forward with minimal friction. Billing forms, service logs, and staffing records functioned as the primary indicators of compliance. This approach worked efficiently for legitimate providers, but it also created exposure. Patterns that might have raised concern, such as repeated high-volume claims or billing levels that strained staffing capacity, were often processed as routine unless flagged by external complaints or unusually large discrepancies. A second vulnerability involved the system's dependence on paperwork as proof of legitimacy. Documents were treated as neutral facts rather than signals requiring contextual analysis. Even when records displayed repetitive or improbable patterns, they were often considered acceptable if they met formal requirements. The oversight model prioritized completeness over plausibility, leaving limited room to question whether the reported activity reflected reality. The most consequential finding, however, centered on accountability. Investigators concluded that while fraudulent behavior could be established at the organizational level, responsibility at the individual level was frequently obscured. Decision-making authority was spread across titles, roles, and administrative layers, allowing control to exist without clear attribution. This diffusion did not prevent the fraud from operating, but it complicated enforcement once legal standards required precise identification of who exercised direct control. That gap between organizational misconduct and individual responsibility proved critical. When legal thresholds demanded exact attribution of authority, enforcement became vulnerable. A system that could clearly show where money went struggled to demonstrate who, in legal terms, had directed each step. The structure did not collapse because evidence was missing, but because responsibility was distributed in a way that resisted narrow legal definitions. This analysis led investigators to a broader conclusion. The fraud itself was not especially advanced. It did not rely on exotic financial instruments or hidden offshore networks. Its effectiveness came from exploiting routine processes, predictable workflows, and assumptions built into a system designed for efficiency rather than scrutiny. What proved fragile was not the law, but the monitoring structure meant to protect it. That realization forced a shift in perspective. Investigators began reassessing other cases through the same lens, asking not only whether fraud occurred, but whether oversight mechanisms were capable of identifying responsibility before legal thresholds were reached. The case became less about one operation and more about systemic resilience. And that realization changed how investigators looked at every case that followed. The public reaction that followed was striking for what it lacked. There were no demonstrations outside courthouses, no visible celebrations, and no widespread displays of anger. Instead, the dominant response was restraint. Communities across Minnesota absorbed the developments quietly as legal professionals, civic leaders, and ordinary residents tried to understand what the collapse of a high-profile case meant for accountability more broadly. The silence was not indifference. It reflected a deeper uncertainty about whether the system still worked in the way people believed it did. That uncertainty quickly translated into pressure behind the scenes. Within political and legal circles, questions began to surface about how a unanimous jury verdict could be erased without resolving the underlying conduct that jurors had already found credible. Lawmakers were pressed to explain whether existing safeguards were sufficient when judicial rulings could effectively nullify months of investigation and trial. Prosecutors warned that similar outcomes could weaken future enforcement, particularly in complex financial cases where responsibility is rarely concentrated in a single action or document. Concerns about deterrence became central to the discussion. Legal experts and advocacy groups noted that white-collar crimes depend heavily on the expectation of accountability. When the likelihood of consequences becomes uncertain, the incentive to comply erodes. If fraudulent conduct can be established, but responsibility cannot be assigned with legal precision, the risk calculus changes. A misconduct becomes easier to repeat, not because enforcement is absent, but because its boundaries are unclear. As these concerns mounted, reform proposals moved from abstract debate to concrete agenda items. Some lawmakers called for stronger judicial oversight, emphasizing the need for transparency when verdicts reached by juries are overturned. The focus was not on restricting judicial independence, but on ensuring that decisions with systemic impact are subject to clear standards and public explanation. Others advocated for clearer definitions of personal responsibility in cases involving complex organizations, arguing that accountability should not dissolve simply because authority is distributed across multiple roles. These proposals reflected a shared objective rather than a partisan divide. The goal was to restore balance between judicial review and the role of juries as fact-finders, particularly in cases built on financial evidence and organizational control. Supporters argued that juries represent a core democratic function within the justice system and that their conclusions should carry weight unless specific legal thresholds are clearly unmet. At the same time, legal institutions began their own internal assessments. Prosecutors reviewed charging strategies, considering whether future cases would require more explicit documentation of decision-making authority. Investigators re-examined how evidence of control and intent is presented, anticipating higher burdens of proof. training discussion shifted toward ensuring that organizational complexity does not obscure individual responsibility before cases reach a courtroom. Through these parallel efforts, a broader conclusion began to take shape. The most serious threat exposed by the case did not come from external actors exploiting the system. It came from erosion within the institution itself, gaps in oversight, ambiguities in standards, and mismatches between modern organizational structures and traditional legal definitions created outcomes that weakened public confidence. The issue was not corruption in the abstract, but fragility in how accountability is enforced. By this stage, the case was no longer defined by a single fraud scheme or a single judicial ruling. It had evolved into a stress test for institutional resilience. Could the system confront its own weaknesses openly, adapt its standards, and reinforce trust without retreating into defensiveness or silence? That question carried implications far beyond Minnesota, touching on how complex financial crimes are addressed nationwide. What remained clear was that trust, once shaken, does not recover on its own. It requires visible effort, clear standards, and sustained commitment from institutions tasked with enforcing the law. Silence may reflect restraint, but it also signals expectation. Communities were watching to see whether the response would end with explanations or continue with reform. Because when trust breaks, rebuilding it becomes the real battle. What happens when a system begins to weaken itself from the inside? When accountability dissolves not because evidence is missing, but because responsibility becomes impossible to assign, the consequences extend far beyond any single case. That question now sits at the center of this story. This was not just about Minnesota. It was not only about Medicaid, and it was not solely about one judge or one ruling. The issues exposed here exist wherever complex systems rely on trust, documentation, and layered authority. When those systems fail to enforce responsibility, the risk becomes national, not local. Yet this case also underscores a defining strength of the United States. The system is not built on the idea that mistakes never happen. It is built on the capacity to identify failure, confront it, and respond through multiple layers of accountability. When state mechanisms falter, federal oversight exists to step in. When public confidence erodes, reform and scrutiny follow. That strength, however, depends on more than institutions alone. A system only remains strong when citizens demand clarity, responsibility, and transparency from those entrusted with power. Accountability is not automatic. It must be maintained. Like and subscribe to Military Power to continue following stories where the United States faces internal challenges and works to protect the foundations that hold it together.